The third significant aspect of the book, perhaps, is my argument that the best way to look at the world of the 21st century is through the metaphor of the World Wide Web. That we are now increasingly a networked world. We have moved beyond the binary world of the Cold War, the binary era where it was one or the other you had to choose and the non-aligned tried to navigate their way between these two. That's over. It ended with the Cold War in 1991. We went through the unipolar moment at the end of the Cold War. Today the world is changing in many ways. I believe that we are moving towards a world beyond superpowers. China is rising, but it's never going to be another Soviet Union. In other words, if you look at superpowers in all the classic definitions of economic and military might, but also in their ability to affect political developments anywhere in the world, the Soviet Union could change a government in Cuba, the US could change a government in Southeast Asia, half a world away from their own countries. I don't imagine China ever getting in this century to a position where it can determine the government of Ecuador or Guatemala or whatever. That era, to my mind, is over. And I think we are looking now at a different world, a world in which increasingly countries will relate to each other through different permutations and combinations and configurations, in which they'll pursue their own interests in collaboration with other countries for different purposes in different ways. Some of these networks will overlap with each other, some will not. India, for example, will be simultaneously focused on and pushing for a major role at the United Nations, while at the same time spending an equal amount of energy in its own neighborhood, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. It will be simultaneously a member of the non-aligned movement, which is a reflection of its anti-colonial heritage, and also an active member of the community of democracies, alongside the very Western, formerly colonial powers whom it's attacking in the non-aligned movement. It'll be a member of the G77, the global trade union of developing countries at the UN, but also of the G20, the global management of the world economy. And all of these seeming contradictions are reconciled in this networked world of ours. Because look at India, they meet every year with Russia and China at foreign minister level in something called the RIC. Then we add Brazil and South Africa and we have the BRICS. Then we take out the Russians and the Chinese and we have IBSA for South-South collaboration. And then you add the Chinese but not the Russians and you have BASIC for environmental negotiations. And India is the only country that's a member of all of these configurations, not only because its name usefully begins with that indispensable element in every acronym of vowel, but also because, of course, India has a useful contribution it can make in each of these groupings, and what is more, that each of these groupings is relevant to the pursuit of some of its own interests. And in this way, it seems to me, the 21st century will play its role out, and India will be a linchpin of a new order. Which brings me to the title, because of course some people raised several eyebrows, including in print when the book came out, because I agree the title suggests that it's somehow redolent of Pax Britannica or Pax Romana or even Pax Americana, this notion of world domination, which I certainly did not intend to connote through the title, because neither is India capable of world domination, nor is the world interested in anybody trying to dominate it. I think that era, as I said, is over. I speak of Pax Indica much more as this networked system, as a system, a peace system, which is what Pax implies, of interrelationships, coexistence, cooperation in these different networked formulas. The book isn't only about all of that. There are specific country chapters. I have gone in some detail into our tortured relationship with Pakistan, also a separate chapter on China, a separate chapter on the US. There are chapters on the immediate South Asian neighborhood, which is so important to India. It's near abroad, both West Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as chapters on the familiar lands and uncharted territories of Europe, America, Latin America, and Africa. And I have a chapter on a subject that has been dear to me for some time. Some of you are probably sick and tired of hearing me about it because I've been going on about it for a dozen years, and that's India's soft power. Joseph Nye's concept, my good friend Joseph Nye came up with this in Harvard in the mid-90s, focused initially on the United States. When I applied it to India, I sent him some of my thoughts, and he approved, so I can feel that I'm following respectfully in his footsteps in applying the notion of soft power to India's engagement with the world, which I believe in many ways, because India's hard power has not been a stellar success, but its great ability to be an attractive source of interest in the world rests in its soft power, in the films of Bollywood, in its cultural values, its political values. As a Congress member of Parliament, I can say that I wasn't even in the party, but I was in the United Nations in 2004, when our general elections produced the extraordinary phenomenon of elections being won by a party led by a woman of Catholic faith and Italian background, who then made way for a Sikh to be sworn in as prime minister by a Muslim president in a country 81% Hindu. And that, I was in the Arab world at the time, and the most extraordinary admiration with that was greeted. And it wasn't about India trying to impress the world, it was just India being itself. And that ultimately is the great strength of India, in my view. And when the world sees that, I believe it can be a huge asset. The Indian taxpayer has nothing to do with the products of Bollywood, but one of India's greatest assets in Afghanistan was that a Bollywood soap opera so dominated the Afghan consciousness during its heyday, when something like 92% of all Afghan TV sets were tuned to it, that essentially you couldn't call an Afghan at 8:30 in the evening. They were all watching the box. The mullahs complained about religious functions being shorn of normal attendance. Weddings were interrupted so that the guests could gather around the TV set for half an hour before turning their attention to the bride and groom. And the British news agency Reuters, marveling at this phenomenon, wrote about how crime was going up at 8:30 because the watchmen were busy watching the TV rather than minding the store. And apparently in Mazar-e-Sharif at 8:30 one evening, robbers stripped a car of every detachable part, the side view mirrors, the hubcaps, the spokes, the windshield wipers, you name it, and they scrawled on the windshield in an allusion to the show's heroine, Tulsi Zindabad, long live Tulsi. and that's the sort of thing that in an Islamic country, which obviously is not easy for a culture to penetrate, for an Indian soap opera to so dominate that culture's conversation about family issues, which would otherwise be literally hidden behind the veil, that gave us a tremendous indication of how India could make an impact. And that, we can talk about Indian cuisine, which is proliferating around the world, Indian yoga. Cuisine, by the way, there are so many Indian restaurants now in England, the former colonial power, that they employ more people than the iron and steel, shipbuilding and coal mining industries combined. So the empire can strike back. Now, so that's on the soft power aspects. I also do talk about the domestic underpinnings of Indian foreign policy, in particular the work of the Ministry of External Affairs. Alyssa and I were just whispering about that because she has read an excerpt from the book that was published relating to that. And I argue that, and I've in fact developed on the argument since the book was published in a few op-eds and columns in the Indian press, that we really have to do something about the gross under-resourcing of our foreign policy. We're punching below our weight on the global stage because we're not devoting enough professional staff to our foreign policy making. It goes back to the days when, as a critic in the 1950s unkindly said, India doesn't have a foreign policy, Nehru does. It was a one-man's vision thing that was being carried out by a small elite group of diplomats. Today, that approach simply won't work. I mean, we've got 141 missions around the world, and we have fewer than 900 diplomats to staff them. And they're simply not enough. We're looking at a situation where, in today's world, Brazil, with a sixth of our population, has 1,200 diplomats. China has 4,200. The British have 6,000 diplomats. And the United States, with all respect to my dear friend Alyssa, has more people reporting to its embassy in New Delhi than the Indian Foreign Service has around the world. So the US, of course, has a 20,000 diplomat foreign service. So we can't ever hope to compete. But for India to have under 900, which puts it in the same league as tiny island states like New Zealand and Singapore. Singapore has 867 diplomats. This is laughable. And I've argued that we need to do something about that. And I've also argued that we need to do something about the kinds of people we're hiring today, because we hire them from a one-size-fits-all Union Public Service Commission examination, which is the same examination from which we hire our cops, our district magistrates, our collectors, our customs officials. And it was fine in the days when government service was all that was available, and the cream of the university's crops would go into these examinations, and you had to be in the top 10 to get into the foreign service, because international service and foreign travel was so rare. It was a very prized distinction. But today that's no longer the case. It's a much more globalized world. There are lots more avenues available. We don't necessarily get the best of the lot sitting those examinations anymore, and the ones who do nowadays much prefer to opt for the domestic services. Even the revenue service, which produces customs officials, is often preferred by many applicants to the foreign service. And instead of taking from the top 10, we're not quite at the bottom of the barrel, but halfway down the barrel, we're picking our people. And I argue this isn't what we need. We need not bureaucrats, but diplomats. We need people, young people who are curious about the world, who have an aptitude for languages, who are able, frankly, to talk to foreigners. And we're not necessarily picking people like that anymore. And we need to reorient our recruitment to be able to do that. And I've also argued that we need to do something on filling gaps in the service today. Right now, we have lots of real shortfall. We don't have enough Spanish speakers. We can't open embassies in Latin and Central America to reciprocate the ones that have been opened in Delhi. We don't have expert climate change negotiators. We don't have, you name it, we don't have people who understand Balochistan, which has become such a complicated issue between India and Pakistan. There's so many areas where we have shortfalls. And in our typical Indian way, we have simply decided to expand the annual intake, which means that we'll spend the next 10 years training and giving experience to these young people to fill the gaps we've had since yesterday. And I've suggested, sacrilege though this may be, that we should fill these gaps right now by going outside the foreign ministry and getting people, including if necessary, from the private sector, from universities, think tanks, wherever, people who can come in mid-career and help fill these gaps with the expertise that they might possess. This has been greeted with shock, horror, and consternation by my friends in the Foreign Service and in the ministry. But the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs, of which I'm a member, and so is Dr. Karan Singh, has strongly put forward this recommendation. So I think the ministry will have to at least give us good reasons why it won't do it if it doesn't. So there's some of this. This may seem like inside baseball to many of you who are not Indians, but it seems important enough to me to put it in as an example of how we need to get our act together better for the future. But that's broadly what the book's all about. I've talked much longer than I intended to, because my idea really was to enjoy the Q&A session with all of you and respond to what you're particularly interested in, which is why I haven't gone into any details about Pakistan policy or China or whatever, because I think we can, somebody asks about it, I'll be happy to tell you what I advocate in the book. But I'm reminded that many, many years ago, when I was researching what became my first book, my doctoral thesis, way back in '77, I was prowling the corridors of the Ministry of External Affairs, and I met a then already retired Indian diplomat who told me in very avuncular tones, he said, you know, my boy, Indian foreign policy, Indian diplomacy, he said, is like the lovemaking of an elephant. It is conducted at a very high level, accompanied by much bellowing, and the results are not known for 2 years. Now, I want to assure you that Indian diplomacy has become much more sprightly and agile since then. It's certainly been effective and purposeful. I just feel it can be better, and I've tried to articulate a vision through which its work in the world can be structured, organized, and understood. Thank you all for listening to me. I look forward to our discussion.